All righty, we are rocking and rolling on another edition of Buffalo Roamer Outdoors. I got Jim McNamara on the podcast. Jim, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing excellent, doing excellent. Always a good day when I get to talk paddling and rivers and adventures and all kinds of good stuff. So I'm looking forward to chatting about it.
Well, great. Thanks for asking me to be on your show. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I saw your a post of yours as we mentioned briefly on a canoe and kayak adventure expedition Facebook page, and right away I was like, "Oh man, that's awesome! Right up my alley." You have a new book out. At least I think it's new. Called "In the Wake: An 80-Day Canoe Odyssey into Canada's Northern Wilderness," and looks fantastic.
Thank you.
How'd you come to write this book?
Well, it is new. Well, it came out in February. Here's a quick shot of the cover here.
Awesome.
And it is on Amazon. How did I come to write it? Well, it is based on a trip that my wife and I did a long time ago, 1991. And we can talk about the details of it. But the short story is that it was a full season long trip in the far north of Canada, and I actually wrote the first version of it in the months after that. So version one was written 34 years ago, sitting in a remote ski cabin in Aspen, and I finished most of it. And that version of the book was very just chronological, more of a journal. We did this, we did that, and I actually did have a publisher lined up then, but for various reasons we had to cancel it. Unfortunately, the publisher died, ironically, in a
Mm.
canoeing accident.
Oh, geez.
And yeah, and at that time, um, things were happening in my life where I went to graduate school and then started a job and a family, and decades went by. And just a few years ago, I decided to revive the story, but rewrote it mostly kind of from a different perspective. Because version one was written when I was 25 or 26, something like that, and very in the moment. And since then, the 90s, kind of the world changed. The This mostly on the availability of information and communication. And so I just decided to rewrite it, keeping a lot of the perspective and the dialogue the same, but with the perspective of age, kind of looking back on what I think was the end of an era before the communication or the information revolution took hold. So it was probably maybe a COVID project that got me back into writing it, and it took a few years, and it finally came out last month.
Awesome. That's exciting, man. And yeah, it's cool, and it's good thing that you wrote down the original journal or kind of original writings for it, huh? And still had it.
Yeah, I still had the early versions on floppy disks, if you even ever saw those, that had
Yep.
been transferred to portable hard disks and eventually onto the cloud. And happen to actually still have the original handwritten journals as well for both
That's
my wife
cool.
and
I just recently, funny that you say that. I just recently came across a CD of photos from a canoe trip in Saskatchewan and a backpacking trip in Alaska from 2007, I think it was. And I just randomly came across it in a drawer in my house,
I. Hmm.
and I'd been meaning to do something with it for some time, but never did. And then, of course, I'm like going to my wife. I'm like, "Hey, do you have a CD drive on your computer?" No. Like,
Yeah,
so I had to go to the public library to
yeah,
put it on the computer, and then switch it over to a jump drive, and then bring the jump drive back to my computer. So I have to imagine just getting it off the floppy disk was probably a small feat.
yeah. I work at a university, and we have the whole history of computer read technology there, so I was able to do the various transfers.
Nice. That's great. So tell me a little bit about the canoe journey. What was it? Where was it? And kind of the bones of the journey.
Let's see. Let's short as possible here. At that time in my life, so I was a canoe guide in Maine during
Okay.
the my summers in college. And at that time, after having grown up in Michigan and never really understanding public land and just what wilderness really was, I'd never seen it until I got this job in Maine and paddling around in the Kennebec and Allagash watersheds there. And it was my first introduction to even camping off the road. And so I thought that northern Maine and southern Ontario were just the epitome of wilderness. And I loved it. And I went back there for years. And, every time I went back, and it was just, oh, there is a road there, and there's a cabin on this lake. And, no, there's a power boat, all which are fine things. But it started to erode kind of my definition of wilderness. And as I kind of saw a little bit more of what it could be, I just got pretty much obsessed with the idea of how remote can you go. And I just didn't think that there was really anything left on the continent. And I was really obsessed with reading early explorers' journals who had what I like to call wild by nature and not by law, where just this landscape that was wilderness just because we hadn't got there yet. And I didn't think it existed anymore. And then I started looking at maps on the continent and realized, there actually is a northern limit to their road system. And beyond that is this massive wilderness from the boreal forest all the way to the Arctic Ocean, where there are no roads, no towns. And I just didn't even know that that existed. And as I just became more and more obsessed with the early explorers and the indigenous people who lived there and used a canoe for transportation, not necessarily recreation. I just wanted to see that land, and then other books led me there, and I got pretty interested in the First Nations history and their kind of exodus from the land. As I read more and more, I said, I just have to go there. And at that time in my life, I like to think it was some ethics at more effect. I didn't have any money. I didn't like the idea of flying in and out of the wilderness. I'll fly anywhere now. So what I wanted to do was drive to the end of the road uh, in northern Canada, and we found this road going into northern Saskatchewan at Wollaston Lake, and from there it's hundreds of miles straight north without crossing a road to the Arctic Ocean. So I said that's where we're going to start, and I wanted to get to the central homeland of this indigenous group, the inland Inuit or the Caribou Inuit. And also, I like the idea of trying to get to the most remote spot on the continent that's farthest from any road or coast to get there and then to get back. So I had this idea that I never wanted to fly into wilderness or out. And so instead of traversing the wilderness, which would have required us to fly out somewhere near the Arctic Ocean, we decided to get to the center of that wilderness and then try to get back on our own. And so it took us about 6 weeks of river travel and lake and portage because there wasn't one river going to where we wanted to go. So we got there, took about 7 weeks to get to this spot. We just took a photo and turned around and started heading upstream and overland to get back before winter. And so that took us
Amazing.
about 80 days total, and we made it.
Amazing. And how did you come up with this, your definition of the most wild place in North America?
I tried to, this was before, digitized computer mapping. So I just got a bunch of paper maps, and I just did my best to measure, um, identified the end of all roads in that area and then the Arctic coastline. So I had this area, and I just tried to find the center point of that. That was more of a secondary goal. It was really just getting to this area where these indigenous groups lived, because it turned out that we went to where I thought was the most remote spot. Came home, and then a few years later, I learned digital computer mapping, and I think we missed it by about 50 miles, unfortunately. But still, we were pretty close.
Amazing. And what what were some of your highlights from this trip, and what do you remember 34 years from now, maybe even before you dug back into the journals? Because I'm sure that kind of brought back some of the memories and the specifics, but what were some of the things that you took away from that trip?
I would say the biggest thing is, it was just two of us in one canoe, just my wife and I. And in hindsight, if my kids were to tell me they were going to do something like that, it would be it's like absolutely no way. Because there was just that feeling of being hundreds of miles away from any access point and no clear route to get there, completely alone with no, we didn't have any kind of emergency signaling. Well, we had at the time was we bought what's called an emergency locating transmitter that aircraft used, for like if they crashed, it would trigger. We carried one of those. Turns out it didn't work anyway.
Yeah,
So we had no communication, and just that feeling of being that remote with no way to call for help was on one hand exciting and on the other hand very scary.
hmm,
We never, it just put an edge on every little thing that if you're close to a road or even have a sat phone or cell phone, you might not think about, but little minor rapids, do we run it? Do we portage it? That kind of thing. Just that added, I'll be honest, a level of anxiety that I did not anticipate. And
sure.
so, just that fear and the route finding too, because no digital maps and just paper map and compass, no GPS.
Yeah, it's amazing. As much as a lot of those things do change with technology and such, some of them stay similar too, and some of the sentiments and feelings stay similar, right? And uh, I automatically, I'm in the same exact boat. Like, I want to get as far away. I feel like I can think clearest when I'm farthest away from anything. And even if it's just like, when I go swimming in a lake or in a river, like, I automatically just want to go out and swim to the dead center of it, like the
Right.
farthest away from any shore, and just float a little bit. And it's just, my wife is always like, come back, come back. Like, I'm going, baby, I'm going.
I
Uh,
completely understand that. Yeah, it's
yeah,
it's distance and it's also time. I mean, on that long of a trip without any contact, there are just levels of being away at it that we had never experienced before. You go on a 3 day trip. Maybe there's a couple hours on that second day where you're into it. You go on a week long trip and you realize, oh, it takes about 3 days to get into that vibe. Then you go on a month long trip and you realize, oh man, things change after 10 days. And we were to the point where, you know, a month into the trip with 2 months to go. And then I remember realizing, like, I had not thought about anything other than what has to happen now,
yeah,
and then near the end of the trip, we realized it was like it had become our life.
yep.
It wasn't that we were on a trip or on a vacation. It's like, this is just what we do. We wake up, we cook our meal, we evaluate the maps and overcome the obstacles, and then go to sleep. And so just that feeling of having absolutely no mental connection to before or after the trip is something that I've never replicated since.
I understand completely. I did a 103-day trip on the Mississippi,
Mhm.
and then more connected certainly than yours, especially that one, and then 70 days across the Yukon River, across Yukon Territory, and interior Alaska, and I 100% understand and know that feeling where it's like, yeah, this it just becomes life. It's not. It's 100%. It's
Mhm.
exactly how you put it. It's just what you do, and that's such a yeah. It's such an awesome feeling, especially for someone who is looking for that or who loves that type of mode of transportation or that way of wilderness. Yeah, it's quite a feeling, and it's funny you said you haven't replicated it since when I did those trips, you know, I was probably a similar age to you when you did yours. I think I was 24 on the Mississippi, or 23 or 24, and then 20, 24, 25 on the. Unlike what my sense is from you, I'm not a numbers guy, and I'm not very analytical or specific. So even my age gets tricky.
I get that.
But uh, yeah, I always thought like, oh, I'm never gonna stop doing this. I'm never gonna, it's always gonna be in the background, and then
Yeah.
you know
Oh, it
things
gets
take
harder and
over.
harder for sure. I thought we'd do something like that not every summer, but thought certainly big trips. And life changes. I eventually, our we replaced our canoe with rafts that we could put the kids in, and just the time gets shorter. Although I will say that I guess 2 years ago now, we did the Grand Canyon, raft of the Grand Canyon, and my oldest son actually organized the trip. And so,
Awesome.
we did shorter trips through that whole period, but then he kind of gave that back to us. So that was a 3 week trip. And that 3 week river trip was probably the longest river trip I've done since the big Canadian trip. And
Yeah,
so it was good.
it's amazing. I did the Grand as well in 2018, same year that I did the Yukon River, and
That's a lot of river time.
a lot of river time. And I've been fortunate to paddle a lot of rivers, even other than those three. And I still think the Grand is it's right up there with anything, man. It is
Oh
just
yeah.
such an amazing place, isn't it?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's spectacular. Hope to do it again.
Yeah. How did you find your trip on the Grand? I mean, what were your takeaways from that one?
It was great. It was until you get in there, it's just didn't realize how much time you can spend in the canyon. You can, as a tourist, you can visit the edges of it, but most people, unless you're a river traveler, don't know. Yeah, it's 280 miles of pretty remote wilderness. Now it's a canyon, so there's stuff going on up on the canyon rim, but you're down in there. And we did it in March, so before the motorized season and before um, before the guided trips can happen. So that was an added benefit, where it was pretty much just us and a few other self-support groups.
Amazing. Yeah, I did it in November, and two things I remember. One is that I think I did it in the end of October into early November. We ended in like maybe the first week of November, and uh, that water was cold, man.
Yeah, it's cold.
There was a lot of times going through some of those rapids where I was like, it's getting chilly. We had a couple people who had dry suits who wore them, and I was like, at the beginning, I'm like, you little, Nancy, you don't need the dry suit. Then by the end of it, I was like, boy, I would have liked one of those.
We all wore dry suits almost all day, every day. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
cool.
And
Yeah,
then the other unique thing I thought, at least for me, for the Grand Canyon was I've done a lot of solo trips, a lot of small group trips. I have a guiding business now where I do, 6-person guided canoe trips. And I love that intimate small group because you really get to know people, and there's nowhere for people to hide. Your true self kind of comes out, which I enjoy. But on the other hand, on our Grand trip, it was a self-supported trip, and it was like one of my guiding buddies had organized it, so it was a bunch of just river rats essentially. And I forget how many people. I don't remember if it was 16 or 18. I forget how many exactly it was, but it was a bigger group,
yeah,
and man, that also made it a lot of fun. Just a complete different uh, uh, trip than I was used to, but uh, just that group camaraderie of being that long in such a magical place was awesome.
yeah. Well, that's the same deal. Our group was on the ground was 16. It takes on a different dynamic. It's kind of parties, not like parties, was kind of a lot of socializing, which I love that. But thinking back to our 91, our 80-day trip, it was just the two of us, and you develop just a whole nother almost unexplainable kind of level of intimacy, where During the day, we're never more than 14 feet apart on the canoe. Um, and in fact, I can hear my wife coming in now. Um, and just that, just dependence, or every night, even just unloading the boats, in a bigger group, you can kind of take a break now and then. But then just the two of us, like, oh, unload, set up camp, cook, and you develop these routines and even traditions within that time frame.
100%.
So
Yeah, and that can go one of two ways, right? It seems like it worked out with you all right if, you're still married, but it can go the other way too.
yeah, no, when we in the book, I mentioned a few times when we told people what we're doing. Most people didn't understand what we're going to do, just didn't really get that there's this landscape that you can disappear into. But all kinds of jokes like, "Oh, I hope you're packing a lawyer," or canoes are called divorce boats. But it
Uh-huh.
went the other direction. We went into the trip actually kind of planning on maybe having some trouble and maybe splitting up a little bit afterwards. But as the end of the trip approached, and it had been just the two of us for, 2.5 months, we slowed down. It's like, oh, wow, we didn't want the trip to end. And we'd kind of have shorter days and lingering and enjoying the evening camping. I mean, now it's intimidating to think about spending a few days with just one other person, but thinking back at that, um, just that just level of intimacy with one other person, that I can't imagine any other way to achieve that.
Yeah, 100%. So on the Mississippi trip I did that one solo,
Mhm.
and, on the Yukon, I actually made plans to do the Yukon on while I was still on the Mississippi, because I was, contacting my buddy and he's like, "Ah, man, I'm so jealous you're out there on the river." I'm like, "It's awesome, A. B, let's do one next year."
Yeah,
And, so we did it, and I've two things. One is, he's still, one of my best friends, heading out to his wedding here this summer in Montana. So I'm looking forward to that. But, just one of the best guys ever. But yeah, we did 70 days, never changed seats in the canoe. He was
hmm
in the front, I
same.
was in the back. Uh, and never really had any issues, maybe some small, tiny ones. But, no big issues. And but with that being said, I always say that if I were to do it again, I think I would do it in two solo boats.
Yeah,
uh just because it
mm,
gives you just a little bit of level of independence where,
yeah,
you don't have to be 100%, 110% on the same page every time. If you want to push off 30 minutes early, go for it. Or if you just want to get away for a second, you can hang back and just have a little bit of autonomy. It worked great for us, but if I were to do it again, I think I would do it that way.
yeah, yeah. The big rivers like that certainly allow you to do that. Um, where did you where did you start and end on the Yukon?
In the Yukon, we started Marsh Lake, which is where the
Mhm.
actual named river starts in the Yukon Territory there, upriver of Whitehorse. Then we ended at the Bering Sea.
Oh, nice. My only experience on the Yukon was we lived in Fairbanks. After
Sure.
that trip, well, we moved to Fairbanks for 5 years and had our first child there. And when that child was, I think, 3 months old. Now, I'm not condoning this to young parents, but we ended up doing a week on the Yukon, from Eagle to Circle.
Yep.
So in a canoe. And that was, again, I don't recommend it in hindsight with little kids, because we had a pack canoe. We drove to Circle, flew to Eagle, and then paddled back in a pack canoe and had our baby in it. And then you kind of realize, just little odd currents take on a whole other meaning when you have
Oh
your
yeah,
kind
I
of
can
fragile
imagine.
cargo in there. But so we did that section.
That's
It's like
amazing.
on the I think on like where we went on our Canadian trip, a difference was we weren't on one river. We were just where we wanted to go. Rivers are flowing northeast. We wanted to go northwest, and so it was a lot of portaging. I don't think we were ever on any body of water for more than a few days the whole time. Where there's a lot of portages, so two boats would have been too much because
Sure.
when we started the trip, we had no resupply points. We carried 100 days of food with us in our canoe, and this is through the farther north we got, the fewer and fewer use the landscape it ever had. So there's trailless portages between lakes, and every portage would take us 4 trips.
Oof.
So to get everything across, so that's actually so it's like, yeah, 3.5 times because you don't come back on the last trip, and so like a mile would end up being um, yeah, like 4 miles of walking
Right.
for each portage. And so, uh, probably, yeah. So just carrying that much gear, adding a second boat would have been impossible.
I understand. Yeah. That's quite the feat in itself. Just not even the paddling, just the portaging, especially with that much food. I assume you guys were able to get it fairly dialed through most of it. But how did you guys feel on the portages going
Well,
into it as the
it was
trip progressed?
brutal in hindsight. And I have to correct my math. Oh, it's every mile is 7 miles of walking because it's, yeah, for four
There and back.
trips. One, two, three, four, five, six, 7. And so we did have a early in the trip. We started out on a big lake and then a big river. And our first portage out of the big river was, I think, on day 7. So we were still fully loaded. We had 4 food packs that weighed between 100 and 130 pounds each, and then 2 equipment packs and the canoe. And I had, when I was doing a trial packing in my yard at home, I thought, oh yeah, we can get everything across in 3 trips, no problem. I'll carry 2 packs. We got to our first portage was 2 miles long, which ends up, we very quickly realized we couldn't do it in 3 trips, so we had to do it in 4. So that 2 miles turns into 15 miles of walking, and with unreal heavy packs. My wife at the time, I think, weighed about 105 pounds and was carrying a 120-pound pack. And so yeah, in hindsight, I can talk about the trip like it was somebody else that did it. It's like I can't imagine doing that. 'Cause on that first portage, there was actually a trail, but as we got farther out and we're mapping our own routes through the backcountry, going from pond and lake, through the woods without trails, it became quite challenging.
What was your longest or most difficult portage? Do you recall?
Well, yeah, it depends on how we measure it. Like the longest single portage between bodies of water was probably 3 miles, but the
It's a
trip,
long portage, man.
well, it gets longer. The trip was, we started in the forest. We had about 3 weeks of going through the forest till we crossed into what's called the Barren Lands, the Arctic tundra. And then the river we were on heads east to uh, basically the Arctic Ocean, Hudson's Bay. Sorry, we wanted to go northwest, so we did have an 80-mile section between that, what's called Newton Lake, and the Kazan River, which is a fairly well-known Arctic river that flows north. And so we had about an 80-mile section of kind of connecting small ponds and little rivers where we're never in our boat for more than, I don't know, half hour. So that
Jeez.
was actually 10 days of pretty much portaging from one watershed to the next and
Hmm.
following these creeks and dragging. So yeah, that, I guess it wasn't one portage, but it was 10 days of portaging most of every day.
Brutal.
Yeah, it was. But that was also one of the more memorable parts of the trip because we just happened to intersect this migration of caribou that we started. My best estimate was we were seeing 20,000 animals at a time
Wow.
in their just very thick migrations, and for the next 6 or 7 weeks, the entire time we were on the tundra north of tree line, we would see minimum of hundreds every day. So
Amazing.
traveling with them, and then since then, as actually when I wrote the book over the last couple of years and did some research, it turns out that caribou herd has diminished significantly down like to maybe 20% of its original population, if that. And when I kind of wrote a little report about that, um, I think we may have been the last to document the size of those massive caribou herds. That's at least what a biologist told me, that nobody sees those vast numbers anymore. Now, there may be someone listening that say, "Oh, I saw it," and that would be great. I would love to hear those reports. But on that, back on the portage, when we first started portaging out of that big lake on that 80-mile crossing, we were our first day, we were about 3 miles up this dry valley, no water around, till we got exhausted and camped. And we woke the next morning to this rustling sound, and I climbed the hill, and the entire valley was like from the lake was just full of caribou that had come to our tent and were confused and snorting and hitting their hooves on the rocks, wondering what to do. Then we climbed the hill, and they just engulfed our tent for hours and just passed by.
Wow. Yeah, that's magnificent, huh?
It was fantastic. So that's when you ask one of the big memories, it's generally the caribou that stand out as on that part of the trip.
Amazing. And to be able to be traveling with them for so long too, that's wild.
Yeah, we saw them in those massive numbers just a couple of times, but then there would be just bands of 100 animals just kind of running around on the tundra.
Hmm. I did a backpacking trip in the Brooks Range of Alaska, and we also came upon a caribou migration. And one of the things uh, that I remember so vividly, multiple things, but I don't know if you experienced this as well or not, but the mosquitoes up to that point had just been horrendous,
Yeah.
and the
Mhm.
black flies were just absolutely terrible. At about, I don't know, maybe 5 days or so before we ran into the caribou herd, we had no idea they were there. The mosquitoes had just disappeared. And we were like, huh, I guess, the weather had died or whatever. And looking back on it, I don't know if this is true or not, but our theory was that the caribou herd had attracted all of
Oh,
the
interesting.
mosquitoes and bugs, and so they almost completely vanished from us at that time, and they had just sucked
Yeah.
all of the bugs and insect life. I don't know how
I
that.
hadn't thought about that, but in hindsight, like we had our worst bug problems were in the forests. And then when we got out of the tundra, I was expecting them to be much, much worse, but they didn't seem as bad as I read. I mean, they were bad. We're head nets every day for
Yeah.
sure. And
Hmm. Uh, how about as you were traveling and doing all of these little jumps and hops and stuff, you mentioned kind of one of the themes of the book is the difference between technology and information age today. uh, as you had those maps, how much had things changed, and did you ever run into times where it's like, well, the map says this but reality is different?
yeah, a few times. Probably the one of the bigger ones was right. We were kind of traveling through relatively, hardly ever traveled country in small lakes and creeks, and for the most part, things were pretty good. But then we were traveling through this one region where it just didn't seem to line up. There was water where land was supposed to be, and land where water was supposed to be, and we ended up spending about a half a day or more just kind of wondering where we were. We ended up going back to our last known point, and then just taking a compass bearing to the next kind of big body of water, and just staying on that bearing, whatever was there, land or water. And so just striking a line through. And we eventually came upon a large beaver dam. So the beavers had completely altered these small waterways. So, and then we saw that a couple of times, but also probably the bigger issue was that you can get maps of different resolution, and we, of course, didn't want to pay for the fine resolution. So our maps were 1 to 64,000. It turns out to be 4 miles per inch. So not very high resolution. And on those, the small streams and creeks become single blue lines. And we learned that much of our route was paddling on these single blue lines. And we got to the first one that we were supposed to paddle up, and there was no water. And we learned that much of our route was essentially not paddleable. And so we were dragging and portaging a lot more than we had planned.
Hmm. And so you still stuck with the plan and just
Yeah,
fought through the dry spells.
pretty much. We did a big loop, and I did map a couple of shortcuts. Like if things were going bad, we could cut off the loop, and there were two major cutoffs, and each time we got to one, like approaching it, we were convinced we're turning around, we're taking a shortcut, and then we would just kind of float on past it, and we ended up doing it. But um, we did have to change our route a little bit to not cut it off, but there's a giant lake out there called Newellton Lake. It's I can't remember, 150 miles long or so, and it was notorious for wind in the explorers' records that I had read. And so we did map a route. We needed to go from the southern end of it to the northern end of it, and we did map a smaller route parallel to it to avoid much of the big lake. But that's the route that we came to that we realized was not paddleable. And I had read some old trappers accounts, and I knew there were some trapper cabins out there, so they must have traveled it. But turns out that we could not find the route, so we ended up having to run about a class 3 river to the southern end that we didn't have maps for. And so we did have several days of where I kind of like that. Like a big theme of the book is kind of trying to recreate what early travelers encountered, or traveling through the landscape with only information from indigenous people, no maps. And so we had a few days of that when we had to change our route. I just knew that this river would get us to the southern end of the lake, and that then we could rejoin our original mapped route after about, I can't remember, a few days. So
Hmm.
that was
What
exciting.
what what did you take away from your research, either about this trip or just I don't know if you've kept it up the interest on the old historical roots and the trapper roots and the First Nations roots, and that were there any interesting either characters that you enjoyed reading about, or things that you took away from those?
Oh yeah, I mean that's the title "In the Wake" is meant to kind of honor those who traveled before, that were in their wake. And I guess the literature that I read kind of spanned, probably the first books on the area were by a Canadian author named Farley Mowat, who wrote a lot about kind of the fate of the inland Caribou Inuit, basically Inuit who lived inland, not on the coast. Now, Farley Mowat has a mixed reputation in Canada for maybe fictionalizing some of the facts that tell a good story, and they're fantastic stories. And his writing about the last days of the Caribou Inuit on the land, that's actually kind of what inspired us to go. We wanted to, it was, I think the first contact with the New World was in the late 1800s, and then by 1940s, the last Caribou Inuit were being airlifted out of the country into reserves somewhere. And we just I wanted to go and find their campsites. And we ended up finding them. We ended up finding large encampments of tent circles and rings that we think were some of the last kind of long-term communities in that region. And that just finding that and the literature around it introduced me to all the what I would say the New World explorers. His name's Joseph Terrell, worked for the Canadian Geological Survey and was the first non-indigenous person to traverse the Barren Lands. And so just reading all those stories kind of what inspired us. I liked the idea of this kind of community of wilderness travelers that were out there not as a vacation from their lives, but it was their lives. Where I like to see where the canoe was a vehicle of transportation and not recreation. And I guess I said it before, but the land was kind of wild by nature, not by law. So just that idea of this community of indigenous people and traders and explorers all sharing information, encountering each other out in the wilderness to learn routes was very appealing. And
Yeah.
so I kind of went into it thinking, oh, I missed that era. And then one of the themes of this book is like, well, we kind of saw the end of another era, before this communication was possible.
Hmm. And when you were there, uh did you run into anybody? Did you run into any communities? What were the people along the trip like that you did run into?
Um, well, that's a great question. So once we were on the interior of the trip, the trip started on Wollaston Lake and ended there. And we actually, once we left Wollaston Lake, we actually only saw one person the entire 75 days. But our start at Wollaston Lake was transformative for a variety of reasons. Because Wollaston Lake is a community of Dene, which is an indigenous group that live mostly kind of in the forests, but would travel out into the barren lands on their, excuse me, kind of hunting. And they were kind of a nomadic people, mostly following caribou, but from the forests up into the barren lands. It was one group, and they're kind of distinct, but connected to the inland Inuit who lived in the central Barren Lands and might come south to trade now and then. So these two separate groups. And when we arrived at Wollaston Lake, at that community, we had to we spent a day, planned to spend a day there. While we were there, we met one of their leaders, a guy named John, who informed us that at the time, that whole region was still the Northwest Territories. And since then, the Northwest Territories has been split into a new province, a new territory called Nunavut, and that has now been administratively controlled by the Inuit. But at the time, the Dene were trying to document their historic use of that land before it was kind of given to their neighbors to the north. But unfortunately, in the 20 or 30 or 40 years before we got there, just their lifestyles had changed and they didn't get out into the landscape anymore. And so they were in an effort to document their traditional use of the land that was being given to administrative control of the Inuit. And it just so happened that a consulting company had conducted interviews a few years before with all these elders, and asked them just to retell their stories of their life on the land. And John, while we were there, and the community just got so excited that we were going into their um, ancestral land that they were about to lose, and asked us, and this kind of turned our trip into just a vacation to a bit of a mission in our minds. They gave us maps of all of their, campsites, old trapping cabins, graveyards, and asked us to take photos of as many things as we could find so that
Wow.
they could document to the Canadian government their use of the land. So it just turned our trip into one, it gave me that connection to that historic use of the land that I was so envious of in the old journals, because I liked reading of stories of the explorers having to ask the indigenous communities that they would encounter for route information. That's exactly what we did. So we had a meeting with the community, and the elders came and they asked us to take the pictures, but we had some route questions that we had no record of anyone traveling, and some of the older members of that community were able to kind of pencil in routes between ponds for us, and so it was just a really meaningful experience for us.
Wow, that's amazing. And how did it go locating some of those spots and taking photos and records?
We found a lot. We didn't find as many, and but along our route, if we would see some on the map, we would look for it. A lot of times, we would just find a evidence of a fire ring or something, um, and sometimes we actually found cabins. But it turned out that just completing our route, we realized it was going to take a lot longer and harder than I had planned. We ended up not taking one single rest day in 80 days.
Oh, wow.
Traveled all day, every day, because we realized we were racing winter to come back, and so unfortunately we couldn't do as much side exploring as I had hoped when we got that map. But we did find a lot. We were able to take photos and wrote a little report. In the end, um, that relationship between the Inuit and Dene is fine, and they ended up not making the case. And the whole problem was that um, the southern border of Nunavut is at the 60th parallel, which is 100, 200 miles south of tree line. So it's very much into the ancestral lands of the Dene. And so, now, so they were trying to make the case that no, part of this should be ours. It didn't go that way, but that I don't know. I think the relationships are fine though. And it's regardless of whether the Dene got that recognition, to me, it was exciting to see that it is a territory that is under administrative control of an indigenous group.
Fascinating. Yeah, fascinating.
So yeah, that was an exciting, because like I said, I went into the trip just envious of these earlier times of that interaction between people who lived on the land and those who traveled through it. I feel like we had our own 1990s version of that when we got to Wollaston Lake.
That's awesome. And how did it go actually going back and rewriting the book? I mean, that's a whole journey, a literary journey in itself. I mean, taking a narrative and more of a black and white, on this day we did that, and weaving it into something more meaningful and more of a story. I imagine that had to be difficult.
Yeah, I mean that's what I tried to do. Is I didn't want the book to be about just a journal of our adventure. I didn't even want it to be an adventure book. I wanted to use the trip to kind of tell that story about just kind of what wilderness means to me and my wife, and that connection between kind of the landscape and the very, not just the indigenous communities, but then the kind of the European explorers and the trading and trapping culture, even the Hudson's Bay Company that developed that community. So, although most of the writing is a bit of like a journal format, I hope that it tells that story of that kind of the wilderness web. So, yeah, it was that was the main difference between the version I wrote in 1992, which was all about me and my wife and what we did. And that when I reread it decades later, I was like, man, who cares about the details of the little trip? And so I tried to tell that bigger story, and I think it worked.
And how long were you working on it?
Uh, let's
How,
see.
how long did it take you to go through this process from when you were first, kicking around? Well, maybe I should do something with this. Or
It wasn't
how did
as
you come
it
to that?
wasn't it was on and off for the entire 30 years actually. Yeah, I probably it took me 3 or 4 months to write that first version, and then it sat for years and years and years. And then in 2008, I stumbled on it's Canadian Canoe Routes, a website that is dedicated to people sharing route information about Canadian canoe routes. And so that had been whatever 15, 16 years after it. And this was my first, you know, the internet had come online since the trip, and I had never really looked. So I got online just to ask a question. Hey, anybody ever been up there? And somebody in the chat group told the story about me.
Oh, wow.
I said, I heard of somebody that did this and then they vanished and they never came back. And so I was like, well, that was me. And that inspired me to. So I did do a lot of rewriting in about 2008 for about a year. And I actually spoke at a meeting of the Wilderness Canoe Association in Toronto that year. And so I had a flare up where that's when I changed the structure of the book and rewrote a lot of it. But then, I don't know, life got busy again and another 15 years went by. And so it was really, when I finally picked it up again, like 3 or maybe even 4 years ago, it had gone through a few versions already. So I would say it was a good year of kind of finalizing, rewriting, and then the publishing process took way longer than I thought. That took another 2 years really to go through editors and everything. That's because I self-published and I didn't know what I was doing. So
Hey, you learn as you go, right?
I think if I were to do it again, I could probably do it in 15 years instead of 30.
Hey, you're cutting your time in half. That's pretty good. How about going all the way back to your time in Maine and working as a canoe guide in Maine? What were those days like, and what do you recall from those? What I imagine would be some formative experiences.
Yeah, that's formative is the right word. Like I said, I grew up in Michigan. I was in Boy Scouts. We did a lot of car camping, and I had never spent a night away from a road, and I didn't really even understand that it was possible. And just by, like I was in college, I took a canoe camping class. It was a weekend trip where I actually paddled down a river and got out in a park and camped. And I just was enthralled by that idea. It was like traveling. I'd never been backpacking. It just wasn't in the culture of where I was from. And, I heard about people in the West who went backpacking. I never knew how you would even go about it. But in the Scouts, there is this network of what they call high adventure bases, and this one in Maine that doesn't exist anymore. I just got a job there, and honestly, I thought we were going to be hiking. And I realized that this is a canoe trip. I guess I can remember the J stroke or whatever that was, and it was as you said, transformative. Just the idea that there were rivers and lakes that weren't just kind of door to door full of cottages. That's in Michigan. Every lake is ringed by cottages, except the very small ones. It's just that idea that you could travel in a wilderness for more than a couple of days. Just kind of that what changed my life, really. And I've been everything I've done since then has been about either water. I'm a hydrology professor now, and yeah, I'll just say it again, it's transformative. You hit the right word.
Amazing. And how about
And how
your?
about your?
All of a sudden, I just
All
got
of a
an
sudden, I
echo
just
somehow. How about your? There you go. You mentioned, you took your young one, 3-month-old, on the trip to Eagle, and then you've had you had your child organize the Grand Canyon trip here recently. What did you find about getting your kids into the outdoors and helping them enjoy the outdoors and kind of have that same or similar passion that you do?
Yeah, uh, I like to think it gave them the confidence, whether it's about outdoor activities or not, just the confidence to move through difficult situations. So they, of course, they might have a different story. They grew up with it, and so I always thought that how can to me, I like discovered the world. I felt like when I was in my 20s, it's like, wow, this is amazing. How come I never knew about this? Whereas they grew up with it. And so part of it, I think, you know, I never understood how they could even, of course, they do appreciate it. And, all of them have their own versions of adventure and exploration, have done their own great things. But I'm still, maybe this is just my personal thing that having grown up with it in that environment and lived it, of course, is a fantastic experience for them. And I think gave them all kinds of life skills. But I just don't see how they could have the wonder and amazement of discovery that I felt. Of course, if they were sitting right here, they could probably say that
Yeah,
they had their own experiences and they were able to hop in at a higher level. You know,
sure.
for me, finding a two or 3 day trip in Maine was life changing. Where for them, they're going on 21-day Grand Canyon trips. You
Yeah.
know,
Hey, it's amazing. I think both hold their own weight. I would think it's all about getting out there, and if it's something they enjoy, then that's great. I mean, I know I'm getting real excited to take my 1 year old out for her first time in the canoe this summer, this spring. So I'm yeah, it's top of mind for me is to try and foster that same love and passion that I have, which of course you can't always do. People are just gonna like what they like, but if there's any way to foster it, I'm certainly gonna try.
yeah, it's a fantastic experience for everyone. I mean, you may be doing it to give them their transformative experiences, but you're probably going to have your own as a parent. Watching their accomplishments and adventures.
100%, 100%. Well, John or Jim, I've really enjoyed talking with you. We'll kind of wind her down here, but a few more before we go is, you know, what's your general takeaway? I mean, we kind of touched on it, but what's your overarching takeaway on your 80-day adventure? Either your the adventure itself, the process of retelling the adventure, or just kind of your overarching ethos on the trip. What's your grand kind of takeaway?
I was. Well, that's a good question. For us, me, my wife, and I, and probably more for me, it was. I tell the stories of that trip probably way more than my friends want to hear, um, and that's because a trip that long, whether it's a trip or something, for me, it was an adventure and a life changing event that I 35 years later continue to draw on for inspiration, and just kind of memories and peace. And I would say that it doesn't have to be a wilderness trip if that's not your thing, but when you're young and in your 20s, do something radical. For me, it was find that spot on the continent that no one else had been to and get there and back. It could be take that risk and start a business. It could be write a book, make a movie, just something that you might fail at. Um, but when you're in your 20s, who cares? Have that failure to build on. So that's the main thing. It's like when I think back on it, it's maybe not necessarily the canoeing or the wilderness, but just something big that I cannot do that now. So do something now that you're physically and mentally incapable of doing when you're even 40.
Amen, man. Amen. The book, In the Wake, an 80-day canoe odyssey into Canada's northern wilderness. As you mentioned, just recently out, so it's a new one. Where can people find it? What's the best way to get it? Is there a best way to get it?
I think the easiest way is just it's available on Amazon. and it's also distributed through places like Barnes and Noble, and so you can get it anywhere you can buy online books. But the easiest is just Amazon. You can Google or search "In the Wake" McNamara. It'll take you right there. You can buy either a Kindle version of it or the paperback, like this right here. There
Awesome.
will soon be a hardcover edition with full color photographs. Honestly, that one, the printing costs are going to be more expensive than people want to pay for a book. So I'm putting it out there, though, probably mostly for family. But if you want to spend more than normal on a book, that will be available soon too. This one is typical paperback costs and easy to find on Amazon. When you see that cover, you'll know you're in the right spot.
Beautiful. It's a good looking cover.
Thank you.
All right, Jim. I think we'll wind her down. I appreciate your time, man. Great hearing your
Yeah.
stories and chatting, canoeing and paddling and adventuring. So yeah, best of
All
luck
right.
with the book and stay in touch.
Okay. Thanks for the invitation to join your show. It's great.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.